Hello and good morning. Welcome to this podcast on corporate accountability. My name is Nico Heller and this is Reboot 2030, a democracy school initiative. My guest today is Bob Hinkley. Bob is an accomplished corporate attorney and a dual Australian-American citizen. During the Obama administration, he was a post-GFC investigator and advisor to the US Department of Justice. GFC stands for Great Financial Crisis, recovering more than $65 billion from a dozen or so banks for illegal behavior, which led to the financial crisis of 2008. Bob is also the author of Time to Change Corporations, Closing the Citizenship Gap. More than 20 years ago, Bob proposed a code for corporate citizenship that would amend the existing duty of directors to act in the best interest of the corporation by adding the following words: but not at the expense of severe damage to the environment, human rights, public health and safety, dignity of employees, or the welfare of the communities in which the corporation operates. In this Reboot Dialogue, we focus on the role the law plays in both enabling and legitimizing corporations to cause severe harm to the environment, and how the proposed code for corporate citizenship would put an end to that. Now, I can see that Bob is already here, so let me invite him in. Bob, good evening, or should I say good morning?
Good evening, Nico.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm well, mate.
I have already introduced you very briefly, so let's kind of dig straight in, Bob. Could we start? I mean, today really is about looking at one aspect of your code for corporate citizenship, and that is, how it could somehow tame, if you like, corporations with regards to the kind of environmental damage they cause. So maybe we start, if you could give us a very brief sort of rundown on sort of a corporate history, if you like, on corporate governance. And also where the code for corporate citizenship comes into this, just to get some context for our discussion.
Sure. I think we should probably start with the understanding that government governs corporations the same way it governs people. In a democracy, people can do anything that isn't illegal. And when I say illegal, I mean pursuant to a law passed by the government saying that this behavior is prohibited. Now, the same is true for corporations, okay? But what's happened is that corporations have changed over the last 150 years. They've become much bigger. They employ tens of thousands of people in some cases. They're backed by billions of dollars worth of capital. And they have the ability to do much more damage to the environment than any human being could possibly do in 100 lifetimes. They have the ability to cause they continually emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And as we all know, this is causing a serious problem for the planet and for the people on it. And when corporations were first conceived, okay, everybody realized that government would now have to regulate them as well as people. But they didn't really see the difference between corporations then and people then. Corporations were much smaller. They operated mostly locally as opposed to globally. They didn't have significant ability to damage the environment back then, or any other element of the public interest that anybody at least was concerned about. And that worked fine for a while. Okay, but it no longer works because basically of all the significant damage that they're able to do. And here's the point: government seems unable to stop them from continuing. When a person creates a problem, or several people create a problem with their behavior, government has very little problem passing laws telling them to stop. But that's not the truth. That's not the same with regard to corporations. Corporations have, as we all know, have built up tremendous political power. And so we find ourselves in a situation where, we've had 27 conferences of the parties. We're having our 28th later this month in early December, where all the nations of the world got together and they said, the emission of greenhouse gases is a significant problem, and we have to do something about it. And all the delegates pledged that they would go back to their home countries and try to do something about it. But we're up to 28 now, and they haven't been able to do anything in terms of stopping this problem. And part of the reason is, like I said, corporations have built up incredible political capital that allows them to keep government from regulating them.
Can I just come in
Yep.
for 1 second? Just for the benefit of our viewers, there's sort of two thoughts in the back of my mind here. One is you to say governments can't do anything about it. Of course, governments are, if you like, run by elected politicians in our democracies. So, by extension, you're presumably saying that politicians can't do anything about it. Now, there's two things about it. One is I think there's sort of the cynic view that would sort of say, well, they don't want to do anything about it because they've all got their golden parachutes, and once they leave politics, they'll be kind of joining some board of some company somewhere, and so they don't want to mess up that relationship. That's one thing. So I think it's quite important to distinguish between not being able to and not wanting to. That's one thing. And I mean, you might be able to say a few words about this.
I will, and you're right about that. It's a case of they won't, for various reasons. They sometimes companies that are causing tremendous damage to the public interest are creating the damage elsewhere, but in their home jurisdiction, they're creating jobs. And so politicians become very reticent to regulate the corporations that's creating local jobs, even though it may be creating a problem elsewhere. But you're right. It's not so much that they can't. They're unable to bring themselves to, is a better way to put it. And this isn't a small problem. I mean, this has gone on for years, and corporations have gotten stronger politically than ever before. So this creates a problem, okay? Because corporations that are causing severe harm to the environment can't be stopped. And that is obvious to everyone now. When I first started talking about the Code for Corporate Citizenship, it was sort of a radical idea, the fact that companies should operate in a manner that doesn't destroy the public interest or doesn't harm the public interest. And at that time, corporate social responsibility movement was very small. It was preaching mostly to the converted. Socially responsible investing consisted of a few mutual funds in New York that invested for socially conscious people, but they didn't total $10 billion in total. We'd had a few COPs at that point, conferences of the parties, but they really hadn't gone that far. This was back before the year 2000, actually. Well, today, times have changed. That sort of idea isn't very radical anymore. People generally believe that corporations should behave themselves. They shouldn't be out there destroying their environment or seriously damaging other elements of the public interest.
Can I come in here once more, because there's a sort of a follow-on question to my last question here. So you're absolutely right. Politicians are like really sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. If they want to be re-elected, they obviously have to somehow maneuver the strategies of corporations who will find ways of playing the markets and, the big bazooka, like we're going to lose all these jobs, to basically continue business as usual. But there's another aspect. And so, of course, your code for corporate citizenship in a way would take that decision away from politicians. It would kind of create a sort of a new baseline that wouldn't be up for discussion. So that in a way actually would be in the interest of politicians, because they wouldn't have to stick their neck out, because it would be regulated by law. But there's another aspect to this, and this is to do with sort of causal relationships. If a company is caught polluting a river, then of course we have got all the instruments to sue that company, because the causal relationship is very clear. They put whatever kind of stuff into the river and it's polluted it, all this fish died, the corporation is responsible. However, when you're talking about severe damage, the causal link isn't always as easily established. I mean, take climate change. Yes, all this CO2.
Climate change is the exception I'm after. So go ahead.
No, this is a point worth discussing, isn't it? Because I'm sure you have an answer to this, but it's an important distinction here between laws that kind of, in a way, are dealing with specific infringements, like polluting a river, kind of going above a certain limit or doing this, that, or the other. And we have kind of fairly established and mature sort of legal systems to deal with this. What you're talking about is something else. It's the sort of the things that fall through the cracks. It's like CO2 pollution. I mean, how exactly would you blame a specific company for the severe damage that CO2 causes?
Well, before we get there, let's just explore a little bit why the type of environmental laws you were referring to protect the river, to limit the amount of a certain toxic chemical that can be emitted, why government can regulate those things, but it isn't able to get corporations to knuckle under with regard to greenhouse gas emissions, because that's really what we're talking about.
That's right.
The answer to that is, and it has to do with the corporate law. The corporate law says that directors have a duty to act in their company's best interest. Full stop. You can also say they have a duty to obey the law, the various environmental laws. Generally speaking, obeying an environmental law, like the ones you talk about protecting a particular river, are not big dollar items for corporations. They don't have, it isn't going to cost them that much to comply with the law. To tell you the truth, if it is going to cost them too much to comply with the law, they'll scream like hell until the law is tamed, made more lax, so that they can do what they need to do. But when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, you have to think about where those things come from. Greenhouse gas emissions come from, among other places, but in terms of the corporate world, big power companies that are burning fossil fuels, motor vehicle companies which are producing internal combustion engine powered vehicles that consume fossil fuels, corporate agriculture, and these are three pretty good examples. And in each of those instances, the companies involved, they don't have a little bit involved in this business. They have billions of dollars involved in this business. And changing their business to no longer emit greenhouse gases would cost them a lot of money. And it's very hard for a director of one of those companies who's responsible, who's supposed to act in the company's best interest, to just walk away from those investments. And so this is where the corporate law works against democracy, and it works in a way that keeps government from being able to effectively regulate. And it doesn't have to be that way. Corporations are they're inventions of human beings. They're inventions of legislatures, actually, which pass the corporate law and say, if you do this, then we will recognize you as a corporation. And we want your corporation to be run by the directors, and the director's duty is just to act in the best interests of the corporation. So even if the company is now, and let me just say this, companies that find themselves in this position, they didn't start out saying, well, we're just going to emit a whole bunch of greenhouse gases and not worry about it, even though we know about this problem. They got started in business decades ago. Greenhouse gas emissions and their effect on the environment weren't discovered until much later. And by that time, the companies already had billions invested. So so they're not entirely innocent. I'm not trying to say that, but the problem is that they continue. It's not that they once did, but the problem is the government can't make them stop. And they can't make them stop. In fact, they do the opposite. They encourage directors to continue because that's the way they act in their company's best interest. It's the only way. The only other thing would be to shut down a plant that might be there, or several plants that are their major operating assets. So that involves writing off billions of dollars. That's not something they're going to do voluntarily. And that's why corporate social responsibility doesn't work, why social responsible investing doesn't work, why the cops haven't worked, because they all rely more or less on corporations voluntarily walking away from these huge investments.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm still trying to kind of, in a way, have a sort of a mental model of where this idea of severe harm comes in, and so to understand better where your legal provision would come in. So one way of thinking about it in economics is the distinction between macro and microeconomics. Microeconomics is the sphere of the individual company and so on and so forth, and macro is like, if you like, of an economy as a whole. So like macroeconomic measures are very different from microeconomic measures or company strategy or corporate strategy. So what you're sort of saying is, at the micro level, the individual river, the individual power plant, the individual this, we have regulations, and this is a constant process of improving that, and this has been going on for a long time. And the more political pressure builds up, the more the denser this mesh of sort of micro legal provisions gets. What you're talking about is a macro level, the equivalent to the kind of the macroeconomic sphere, where you're sort of saying, well, this isn't actually just damaging one river or damaging one local community, but this is actually damaging, you probably would go as far as saying damaging mankind, damaging the planet in its fundamental, if you like, sort of existential state. Is that a fair distinction? Just to think about macro.
That's a very good distinction. More or less, business regulation, environmental laws, workplace safety laws, other laws that regulate business, they keep a lid on most damage companies cause to the public interest. But when it comes to something like greenhouse gas emissions, or for argument's sake, an industry that kills 8 million people a year through the mass manufacture and marketing of tobacco, for instance, governments haven't been able to stop this. And so that leaves you with one alternative. If there are things out there that are harming the public interest severely, and we'll get to that in a minute about exactly what I mean, that government can't stop, there's only one alternative, and that is to prohibit directors from being in that business from the beginning from the day they are organized. And for those companies that are out there now that were organized decades ago, it's a statement that has to be made to say this behavior is no longer acceptable, and you are to make it stop. It's a new duty. The new duty is you will act in the best interest of your shareholders and company, but not at the expense of severe damage to the environment. Now, the question then becomes, what is severe damage? And to that, I always like to use the example of the U.S. Supreme Court when asked to define what pornography is. And some justice said, well, I know it when I see it. And all I can say is, can anybody really argue these days that global warming and climate change aren't severe damage to the environment, which are caused by the emission of greenhouse gases? We all know it has to stop, but we haven't been able to make it stop. Now, the thing about putting this change in the corporate law, yes, every jurisdiction has its own corporate law, but more or less, they all say the same thing. Directors should act in the best interest of the company. And what the Code for Corporate Citizenship says is that we should add 11 words to that, but not at the expense of severe damage to the environment. So in other words, what happens is when a corporation gets formed, its directors know that they have to work for the best interest of the company, but they also know that there's limits on that, those limits are that when the company gets found causing severe harm, like what's happening with the emission of greenhouse gases and climate change, they're going to be forced to stop. And if they got a big investment in that, well, that's just tough luck. The law takes over there and says, now your duty is to protect the public interest. And when you think about it, that sounds maybe a little radical, but why should companies that are invented and live according to a license provided by state government or government not be restricted when it comes to causing severe harm to the environment? I mean, it's really pretty simple, I think.
There's a couple of industries.
No human being can do that.
There's a couple of industries that that have only really come into their own in the 20th century, or more recently even with artificial intelligence in the 21st century. I'm thinking specifically nuclear power back in the 20th century, and then of course now AI, artificial intelligence, just now. In both of those instances, like the world, the powers to be realized and recognized that these technologies, that these industries have the potential to cause severe harm in different ways. I mean, nuclear power through atomic bombs and so on and so forth, and of course with AI. I'm sure you're following the debate as well. All the kind of the damage that can cause potentially. Not only in terms of like sort of AI-enabled warfare, but of course also in terms of fake news and deep fakes and this and the other. So we kind of know the severe damage that these technologies, these industries can cause, and we have intuitively with nuclear power and now again with AI, there are kind of broad coalitions forming and have formed in the past to limit the damage that these technologies, these industries may cause. Now, this was a sector by sector approach. So, like the nuclear industry was about nuclear. The AI industry is about AI. And what you're sort of saying is we have to move from a sort of a sectorial kind of approach to a fundamental reassessment of what companies are allowed to do. Is that right?
That's exactly right. The law is always behind developments in technology. The technology comes along. At some point in time, we find out, oh my God, look at the damage this is doing. There ought to be a law. And that's when politicians and government get to work at trying to find a way to regulate. The missing point is that, greenhouse gases they've been building up for years. And companies in the fossil fuel industry, companies that are generating the greenhouse gases, they've known for a long time that this was going to be a problem. Wouldn't it have been better if their directors early on had a duty to protect the public interest from severe harm, to protect the environment from severe harm? Wouldn't that have made them more cautious with where they invested their company's dollars in terms of new power plants, fossil fuels versus renewables? I think it would have. So again, I'll go back to tobacco. I mean, the tobacco companies knew long before everyone else that they were killing people. In my experience, most directors of big companies are good citizens of themselves. Some of them are pillars of the community. And they get put in a position where they're told they only have to represent the company's interests. Not they only have to, but that's all they should do. If there was a caveat to that from the beginning that said, but not at the expense of severe damage to the environment, the public health and safety, or other elements of the public interest, they would make them a lot more cautious in their business dealings. And I think that is a very good thing. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure that the system that we now have of corporate law and capitalism and democracy works without this safeguard that I'm talking about, the Code for Corporate Citizenship. Because we find ourselves in a position right now where there's an existential problem building out there, and we can't stop it. We've had all the brightest people in the world get together 27 times, and they haven't been able to stop it. They've been interfered with. Yeah, there's been a lot of misinformation generated by the fossil fuel industry that's kept them from seeing this. So we haven't been able to negotiate business regulations to keep it from happening.
Another question, yeah, but a question. So when we're talking about severe harm, take CO2 emissions, carbon emissions. Like, say, a company like a major whatever oil kind of refinery producer, whatever, emits huge quantities of CO2, but at the same time, basically invests huge quantities, a vast amount of money in carbon capture technology, so that it can make the business case to say, well, yes, of course, we are emitting these CO2 carbon into the atmosphere here, but over here, we're capturing it. Would that emission still be severe harm, or would you look at a net calculation, like offset against sort of mitigating
Definitely
measures?
Not a net calculation. The question is, are they emitting significant quantities of greenhouse gases that are not being captured and are contributed to climate change and global warming? You don't get credit for planting trees. You don't get credit for
Isn't it a bit like, Bob, isn't it a bit like you shoot somebody in the leg and then take him to a doctor to get it fixed and say, well, it's fixed. I took him to the doctor. It's not a bit like that with sort of.
Well, it is like that. I mean, it's not an argument that we should that anybody should give too much credence to.
But it is very heavily pushed, especially at the moment, or coming up at the COP28 in Dubai this year, because this is exactly what this is going to be about mitigating measures such as carbon capture.
Yes, the COPs have gone from, how do we stop these guys from doing this? They've given up on that. The last COP was about, how do we compensate lesser developed countries that are going to bear the brunt first of global warming and climate change. And now this one is they're going to talk about things like programs of carbon trading, carbon taxes, carbon offsets. They've given up, and the fact that they've given up, well, you have to start thinking, well, why is mankind being held subject to the profit motive of these big companies when our governments gave these companies life. They provide them with a license to operate. We shouldn't give any company a license to operate that's going to cause severe damage to the environment. It's that simple.
What I wonder, Bob, and I have, obviously you're in a much better position to kind of to think about this, and I'm not even sure whether you could give a direct answer to this right now, but I think it's worth contemplating. I give you an example. If I'm aware that my neighbor is causing severe damage, and I do not do anything about it, even though I would have a remedy to prevent that or from stop that, a legal remedy to do that, would I be negligent? Would I in some ways be seen before the law as complicit in this? In other words, what you're saying is through the Code of Corporate Citizenship, we have a clear avenue, we have got a clear remedy to put a stop to this, but we're not doing it. And the question is this in itself actually a case of negligence, or is this just the way politics?
No, I don't think it's a case of negligence. Winston Churchill once said of Americans, but I'll say it applies to all democracies, and he says they'll always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Well, this problem came to light about, probably 30 years ago. People really started talking about it. And so we've had 28 cops. Okay? The cops didn't solve it. We've had corporate social responsibility evolve into ESG. Every business school in the world teaches ESG these days. Every major corporation has an ESG department. It didn't solve the problem. The stockbrokers and investment bankers came along and they said, well, we have a way to fix it. We're calling it socially responsible investing. And we'll provide money to get people to do the right thing when it comes to the environment. It was nothing 30 years ago. Today, they brag that it's over $30 trillion is under socially responsible management. They haven't come close to solving the problem. It's not going to get fixed by encouraging companies to do the right thing, asking them politely, begging them to do the right thing. They have to be told. And the way to tell them is, you no longer have the right to cause severe damage to the environment, and we're putting your directors in charge and responsible for making sure that doesn't happen.
In a previous talk, and I saw the video of it, you're actually saying that through the law as it stands today, the corporate law as it stands today, governments are not actually just allowing this to go ahead, but they are actually legitimizing. And legitimizing is a really potent word in this case, because they are legitimizing essentially the extinction of life on this planet. I
don't usually use the word legitimizing. I usually say justify or excuse. But legitimizing is just as good a word.
If I can refer to it and say I'm acting within the law, then clearly that is legitimizing
But it's worse than that. I'm not acting within the law. I'm doing what the law now tells me to do.
This is why it's legitimizing.
The law has to be changed so it tells them to do something different.
Exactly. So how are future generations going to look back on this period in time when there've been clear proposals on the table to change the law so that we no longer legitimize, but in fact prevent severe harm from taking place, but we're not doing it? How will future generations?
Well, let's hope there are future generations, but I won't appear to be that. I will try not to appear to be that alarmist. But it isn't like people aren't trying to do something about the problem. I mean, those three examples I just used. There's also a movement called the B Corporation, which allows directors to not only pursue profits for shareholders, but requires them to have some sort of social benefit. Now, these companies, they're very small companies. As far as I know, there's no big oil companies or big power producing fossil fuel burning companies or motor vehicle companies that are big corporations. But there's lots of people trying to get companies to do the right thing. It's not like we haven't had 28, 27 cops. Okay, we've got presidents come, prime ministers come, dictators come. They all come and they say they're going to do something. When they go home, they don't do anything. But they don't know what to do. Okay, the Code for Corporate Citizenship has not had that much airtime because there's a lot of people saying, well, maybe we don't have to go that far. Maybe we should try this. And without denigrating their efforts too much, there's often people that are making lots of money in these industries, ESG, socially responsible investing, going to fancy meetings all over the world once a year, but they're not solving the problem. Think of it this way. Think of all the environmental organizations out there formed to fight greenhouse gas emissions. They haven't solved the problem. They haven't got together and said, hey, this is a global problem. How do we really solve it? Because what we're doing isn't working.
Another question, Bob, sort of an ethical question, if you like. From a consumer perspective, I'm pretty sure that you have a car as well. So, how dare you tell the oil majors to stop causing severe harm whilst you're happily driving your motor car around town? So
yeah, that's an argument. But I'll bet you didn't invent. I bet you didn't invent that argument, Nico. I'll bet that came from the fossil fuel company.
That's right.
Okay.
But what's your response to that?
The idea that people should go out and buy and not buy products that are causing this problem and pay extra money for products that won't cause the problem if there's enough production to allow that. It's when you think about it, it's sort of a silly argument. Okay, people aren't causing global warming. Big corporations are causing global warming, and only a very few big corporations, I'll say. I mean, the Code for Corporate Citizenship would apply to all companies, but the number of companies that it would really apply to in terms of closing down the emission of significant quantities of greenhouse gases is probably less than 200 worldwide. That is an infinitesimal proportion of total corporations out there. All corporations would then, if the code were passed, would become more careful, and that would be a good thing. But the ones that would really affect are just the big fossil fuel producers and the companies that are actually burning the fossil fuels and creating the emissions. And when you think about that, it isn't like they don't see the handwriting on the wall. They're playing a game right now to try to stretch out as long as possible these plants that they have invested in and not have to write them off and tell the shareholders that they've lost a lot of money. But they've seen that, they know the handwriting is on the wall, and it isn't like there isn't alternative technology out there. We all know that there are electric vehicles, and they're getting better and cheaper all the time. We all know, especially in a country like Australia, how much renewable energy there is that's being created to replace fossil fuels. Now, the transition, unless it's well structured, will cause some hiccups along the way, but it isn't going to be long before solar and wind and battery power and other forms of alternative energy replace fossil fuel burning power plants. It isn't going to be long before big auto manufacturers stop producing motor vehicles that cause the emission of greenhouse gases. It's going to happen. The question is, are we going to let them dictate the timetable, or should we? But even above all that, think about this. When corporations were first invented, there were safeguards in the corporate law or their corporate charter that said they could not cause severe damage to the public interest. Okay, they were prohibited from doing that. And then in about the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the Industrial Revolution started to get traction, and companies wanted more leeway in how they ran their businesses. And Delaware was one of the first states to change. And they said, well, we're going to take out this bit about how you have to protect the public interest as well as act on the best interest of shareholders. We're going to cut it back to just act on the best interest of shareholders. Well, in 1870, 80, and 90, that wasn't that big a problem. Companies were smaller. They didn't act globally, and they didn't cause the damage then that they do today. So what I'm really suggesting isn't, it goes back in time to say, henceforth, corporations, corporate directors should have a duty to see that their company no longer causes severe harm to the environment and the other elements of the public interest.
I mean, the CO2 in a way is a kind of an easy example, because we all know that CO2 emissions are bad. And so we don't have to calibrate that. We just know that if you're producing loads, it's very bad. And if you're producing little, it's still bad. But I mean, take, sort of agribusiness. I mean, specifically deforestation. Cutting down a tree in itself isn't bad, yeah? Because, I mean, we all have to, in a way. I mean, forestry builds around this idea of cutting down this tree and letting that tree grow. Now, so cutting down a tree isn't as bad as, like the equivalent putting out CO2. But of course, if you're cutting down loads of trees, and it becomes deforestation, and at a macro level, it has a significant, like take the Amazon, for example, a significant impact on the climate. So if a business is in the business of creating agricultural kind of like fields for agricultural use, at what point is this becoming severe harm?
I'll make it simple. There is no reason why at the time you pass the code, you pass a list, you also enact a law which describes what you're talking about in terms of business that are causing severe harm. And number one on that list would be the emission of significant quantities of greenhouse gases. So you're not talking about companies burning down or leveling forests and not regenerating them. You're really talking about one thing. And that's the thing that they're all meeting in Dubai to try to fix, for what it's worth. And over time, that list could be added to. I, for one, would put tobacco on it. I think that we're a long ways from this, but a lot of developments in social media, AI, they someday may run into this problem. I don't think we're there yet, but they may. And the fact that they may run into this problem of going on the list, is going to cause them and cause their directors, every time a major investment is made, when the management comes in and presents the proposal, they're going to check more than what's the internal rate of return on this project. They're going to say, and what's the effect on the environment, on the public health and safety? What's the effect on the well-being of our communities and the dignity of our employees? And those are good questions for directors to always be asking, and I think it should be part of the law.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, like, for example, say you are a farmer, a family farmer, you run a family farming business, like say a dairy farming business. You've got like 250 cows, and that gives you a good income. It's not super, but it's a good income, and your family has lived on that for generations. Now, of course, these cows, being a dairy farming business, will emit, significant quantities of CO2.
No,
Of course,
not your 250 cows. They're not going to emit significant quantities.
I mean, they would emit more than if you would grow potatoes. Yeah, so
but that's not the test. That's not the test. Is it more damage? Do they cause more damage than potatoes? Do they cause severe damage to the environment? And 250 cows don't. I mean, I heard the other night at a dinner party, actually, well, I don't want to not be able to have hamburgers. Well, nobody's saying anything about stopping meat production. But I'll tell you what, I would imagine that if the code were passed, people in the meat production business would start looking at ways that they could reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions so they didn't someday get in the same pickle that the fossil fuel companies and the motor vehicle companies are in.
I think one way of kind of getting one's head
but then again, it doesn't apply to the sole dairy farmer.
One
even
way
though he acts in.
That's right. I mean, one way I think of getting one's head around this is if we go back to this macro and micro example, economics. So, I mean, if you look at anti-competitive behavior, I mean, every small corner shop is in some ways anti-competitive because they want to survive, and it's fair game. Yeah, we all do whatever we can to kind of capture our audience, but that's very, very different from, say, an Amazon or like, say, like a really kind of
that's a good analogy, Nico. I like that analogy. I like.
Yeah.
That.
So there is a kind of, when you think about
when it comes to greenhouse gases, it's probably going to apply to 200 companies worldwide,
or fewer, even. Yeah.
Even maybe even fewer. So
I think it's
and when that happens, those companies are going to say, well, the day that we were hoping to put off to 2050 or 2035 has arrived. What do we do now? Well, they're going to find ways to operate their business that doesn't emit greenhouse gases. I mean, for the power producers and the motor vehicle companies, we're a long ways down the track to developing those sorts of technologies, and that's going to create an incredible incentive for capitalism and venture capital to help develop new technologies to help these companies get out of their pickle, as I say.
So it's interesting. So I mean, when we are regulating to essentially guarantee competition and fair play in a market, we're not concerned about the corner shop, but we're basically interested about market makers, about the people whose behavior can shift the behavior of prices, can shift the behavior of.
You're absolutely right. That's a very good analogy.
And every corporate lawyer understands that distinction, so it's very, very clear what is a market shifting or a severe harm in your example, and what is a kind of a corner shop kind of doing what any corner shop would do. And I think this is, and the other thing is, of course,
Well, I always say significant quantities of greenhouse gases. If you wanted to, your companion legislation that says we mean you, fossil fuel companies and power producers and motor vehicle companies, you could put a limit on it. You could say that emit more than so many tons per year of greenhouse gases or whatever, however they're measured. You could get that specific. And
the problem is the more specific you get, the more sort of workarounds you create, don't you? Because
absolutely right. And that's why I don't want to get specific, because by not being specific, you create a risk for directors. The risk is they're going to get caught out and it's going to cost them a lot of money down the road. So that's a risk they now have to monitor, which right now they're really not monitoring. Okay. They're not careful. They're not cautious. They don't use the precautionary principle. They want to know what the internal rate of return is and how much they're going to be able to pay shareholders in dividends as a result of that next year. Their job needs to become a little bit tougher. Not a lot tougher, but tougher in that they realize that not only are they directors for their shareholders and their company, but they're also run major businesses that have an effect on the public interest, and they should not be causing the public interest severe harm because they operate under a social license. If they didn't have a charter granted by the state, they wouldn't be able to run the business that they run. They owe their very existence to the people, to the citizens of the various countries, and they shouldn't be causing them severe harm. They shouldn't be killing them. Okay, that's got to stop. And once we start thinking about putting limits on corporate behavior that causes severe harm, this will be a much better world because directors will take that job seriously.
You know, in your sort of previous kind of account of sort of corporate governance history, you give this example of sort of the race to the bottom, and where Delaware in the US essentially became the least regulated and ultimately then the standard for corporate law. You know, and that there was a time when corporations were more regulated, and then there was this kind of race to the bottom to free them and so on until they basically had what we have today.
Correct.
How would we prevent? Let me just say, how would we prevent corporations? Say, if Australia were to bring in that kind of corporate duty, how would we prevent these corporations just to move to New Zealand?
I'll answer that in just a second. I want to say that Delaware was one of the states that went first and eliminated any duty to the public interest. But once they did, they made it a requirement for every other state, if they wanted to get companies to incorporate in their jurisdiction, to also eliminate it. That's why they call it the race to the bottom. I think the code will actually start a race to the top.
How would
because
that happen?
I think, well, let me tell you. First of all, it's been polled a number of times, but people, consumers, customers want the companies to be socially responsible. They don't want them to be causing severe harm, damage to the environment. They don't want them to be causing severe harm to their communities. And companies see this. This is what happened in Business Week ran a poll in 2000. And it said, which do you agree with more strongly? Companies should all be about maximizing profits for shareholders, and if they do that, everything will be best for the U.S. economy. Or companies should sometimes sacrifice profits for the benefit of the environment, employees, and the communities in which they operate. And at that time, there really wasn't any corporate social responsibility movement. There wasn't any socially responsible investing. There was no ESG, and surprisingly, 95% said they agreed with the second statement, that they wanted companies to sometimes sacrifice so as not to cause severe harm to the environment. So if the code makes it into law, if people stand up and say at the next election, what is your position on the code for corporate citizenship? Are you for it or against it? I think it's going to be very hard for a politician to say he's against it. And I hope if he does, he won't get reelected. But when corporate social, when that poll was sort of a watershed in that, because corporations started to realize, hey, these are our customers. We have to take care of them. And, you know, in those days, the American Business Roundtable, their position was corporations are all about making money for shareholders. The American Business Roundtable is an organization of 200 CEOs of America's largest companies. And they said that's what it was. 1996, they issued a statement. Our job is just to make money for shareholders. Well, in 2019, 182 of those 200 said, well, we think that companies should also consider the interest of other stakeholders, specifically the environment, employees, and the communities in which they operate. The world has moved. The law has not moved with it yet. But I think if you have a debate on the issue as to whether or not corporations should have a duty to protect the environment from severe harm, you're going to win that debate. And the beauty of changing the corporate law is it's the same in every jurisdiction. This isn't like we have to have a different argument every place we want to pass a law. The law is the same. And changing it to say corporations have a duty to protect the environment from severe harm, I don't think it's too big of an ask. And I don't think you'll have a situation, which was your original question, where Panama, Liberia, and the Turks and Caicos Islands or something decide, well, come here and incorporate. Corporations aren't going to go change their origin, their jurisdiction of incorporation to avoid the code. And if they did, jurisdictions like the United States, like Europe, like Australia, New Zealand, they have the ability to keep companies that haven't adopted, from countries that haven't adopted the code, from operating within their jurisdiction. They're not going to do it because their customers want it. And for them, it's just a new rule, okay? Yeah, it's going to make their business more expensive for a while until they find ways to reduce the externalized cost. But I don't think we have. I think it'll generate a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, or a situation where countries seek to take advantage by not passing the code.
I mean, I can see.
In that regard, I'll say that Europe, as you may know, the European Parliament passed something very similar, asking the European executive to have the corporate law changed in their member states' jurisdictions. It didn't get through, but I mean, we're already, it's a case of we try everything else, and the dial moves.
Are they? I mean, I think all the arguments against adding that provision to corporate law have to do with the cost of transition. So the argument will be, oh, but we haven't got enough electric cars today to basically make the switch straight away. Oh, we don't have this. Oh, so there is a kind of a transitional argument, which actually is probably very hard to combat. Now, what about this? Are there any kind of legal precedents where a law has a phase-in, kind of a phased-in kind of situation where you'd say, within, by the year 2030 or by the year 2035, so that companies are given some, lead-in time to comply?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, what are we talking about tonight? We're talking about whether it's going to be 2035 or 2050 before we get out of the burning of fossil fuels. You can't pass the code for corporate citizenship on Tuesday and expect ExxonMobil or a big power company in Australia or Europe to stop burning fossil fuels on Wednesday. You're going to have to transition in. So there will be companion legislation that goes with the code. But the code itself, in its essence, is companies no longer have the right to cause severe harm to the environment. And whether you phase that in over 3, 5, 7, or even 10 years, we're going to be way ahead of having 10 more cops, getting $30 trillion more under socially responsible management, having greater penetration of ESG. Those things won't work because they're voluntary and they go against the law that tells directors they're supposed to.
Here's another thing. Now imagine, because we can turn this round, rather than sort of saying, oh, well, you guys need time, we can turn this argument around. Imagine we do this. Imagine instead of say, you basically promote a code with the specific addition of a date when this would come into effect. So let's just, for the sake of the argument, but this is obviously something that we would have to think really quite hard about and realistically about, but let's just, for the sake of the argument, say 2030. Let's say we'd said by 2030, this provision, no severe harm, needs to be included. So what that means, if this becomes a hard deadline, companies will very soon then start saying, but if we want to meet that, then you're going to have to help us in this, that, and the other way. All of a sudden, it would become an imperative, a corporate imperative to transition to meet that law. And that would change the whole dynamic, because now companies would innovate towards that deadline rather than innovate to push it out.
That is a brilliant insight, and that is exactly right. And you know what? If they don't start to innovate and find solutions, what do you think is going to happen to the price of their shares on Wall Street? Okay, because they'll see the problem coming. It'll be the first question at every analyst meeting. How are you doing in terms of coming around to complying with the Code for Corporate Citizenship? What are you doing to stop greenhouse gas emissions? It's not
it's
just
no longer
going
hypothetical.
to be.
It's no longer hypothetical.
Yes, and it's not something that they'll be able to cover up with nice greenwashing language in their annual report. They'll have to really be doing something, and that will spur new investment in new technologies, new companies being formed, because they'll find ways to generate electricity without burning fossil fuels. They'll find ways to power motor vehicles without burning fossil fuels, and all that money that's in social responsible investing, some of it's going to go into developing solutions. So
I have a sort of a proposal here, Bob. I mean, you do have quite an extensive sort of network of supporters, of activists, but also still into the business community and other areas. How about thinking, if you like, a manifesto? A short manifesto, nothing long, nothing flowery, but literally just enshrining this idea of a hard deadline for the code to come into effect, so that we exactly push this argument that we've just discussed here. Because at the moment, you don't have that transition argument on your website. You don't have that as a core blanket of the argument. And I can see how any politician who wants to sort of to knock it down can just have this kind of, bazooka saying, but we're going to lose all these jobs. So how about turning this around? How about having a short manifesto and see how many signatories, across the different areas, from economics, from science, from the business community, from politicians, we can get to put their name behind this, so that this deadline becomes a rallying cry for a whole new era of corporate law.
Funny you should say that, because actually we do have a manifesto. I haven't put it up on the website yet. It's patterned after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And the reason I did that is because you want to portray the code as a clean break from the way things have been, as the founding fathers in America did in 1776. So first it lays out why we need this, and then it says what we expect to change. And what we expect to change is corporate behavior, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to make corporate directors responsible for making sure their company no longer foists severe damage on the environment and certain other elements of the public interest. So keep an eye out on the website.
But what is important, though, is that you add to that a hard and fast date by which that manifesto demands that code to come into action, and then to basically start to solicit support for that, because that would give it the momentum it needs. Otherwise, it just remains an aspiration. But if we're sort of saying, well, a 10-year window, a 7-year window, a 15-year window, whatever you might consider realistic, and whatever you think, would maintain the momentum of your campaign, if you were to include that, it would be very interesting, because there's a whole bunch of legislation.
I'm sold, Nico. I'll include it.
There's a whole bunch of legislation that actually, and obviously you would want to possibly look at that legislation that is coming into effect when motor cars are going to, fossil fuel powered motor cars are going to phase out in Europe.
There's no magic in the language. The language is what you want to put into the code. Basically, what you're saying is a transition period, beyond which date there is no more emission of significant quantities of greenhouse gases. And whether it's
or severe harm to the environment, yeah.
That's entirely, that's a very good idea.
But the actual date is crucial. I mean, for example, I think in Europe they're phasing out petrol-powered motor cars. I think it's in 2035 or whatever it is. There's a specific date. Of course, you would want to harmonize your date with the kind of the majority of that legislation, so that you're not then basically have a situation. Do you know what I'm saying?
You make a good you make a good point there. I think because the code will be passed in every jurisdiction, and so how it's not necessarily the case that the member states of the EU will look at it the same way as the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. And maybe in certain circumstances, those jurisdictions and the companies in those jurisdictions, it's important for some reason that it be delayed further than tomorrow. Okay.
That's right.
But so that could be negotiated, but I wouldn't want to open the door too wide.
No.
So that the date went, we're back talking 2000.
No. This is exactly, that's a balancing act, isn't it? It's kind of to basically, because that may then also help, other jurisdictions, like, for example, a sort of a European level jurisdiction, to reassess, to say, well, I mean, if the US, Australia, and so on and so forth are buying into this code, maybe Europe should as well. So you're absolutely right. There is a kind of a sort of a sweet spot, in a way, and you're just going to have to sort of figure out what that sweet spot is. But I think to include an actual date by which that transition has to be complete, I think is really critically important, because then it becomes real and the signatories are committed to that. And if it was to be signed into any legislation, it would mean that that government is not only committed to your code, but to all the legislation it is essentially bringing in the interim to achieve that code.
Yes, absolutely. It would set a boundary that would encourage governments to not only monitor, for instance, progress towards the solution, but also help companies develop ways to make the transition faster. I think that's right.
Bob, this has been a really good dialogue again. Thank you ever so much. I always really enjoy
talking with you.
It's very insightful. Stay healthy, stay good, and let's continue this dialogue in the not too distant future.
All right. Be my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Bob. Have a good day, or good evening, I should say.
Okay, you too. Good day.
Bye-bye.